Hello, my lovely friends. It's Emma from A Vintage Girl in a Modern World. You know, there are some people who never seem to go out of style. Not because they were the loudest. Not because they tried the hardest to be noticed. But because they had something that's almost impossible to describe. A natural warmth. An effortless charm. And a way of making everybody around them feel completely at ease. And for me, Dean Martin has always been one of those people. Whenever I watch one of his films, listen to one of his songs, or put on an episode of The Dean Martin Show, I can't help but smile. Because he never looked as though he was trying to entertain people. He simply seemed to enjoy every moment. And somehow, that joy became contagious. And I think that's one of the reasons Dean has remained so loved all these years later. Because he reminds us that life doesn't always have to be serious. That it's okay to laugh, to relax, to enjoy the company of good friends, and to appreciate the simple pleasures in life. Now, this isn't going to be a biography of Dean Martin. There are plenty of wonderful documentaries and books that explore every chapter of his remarkable career. Instead, I simply wanted to spend a little time talking about why Dean Martin still makes me smile. Why I think his unique style of entertainment is just as enjoyable today as it was decades ago. And why, in a world that often feels so rushed and noisy, spending an evening with Dean Martin still feels like the perfect way to slow down. So make yourselves comfortable, grab a lovely cup of tea, and let's spend a little time together talking about one of the most effortlessly charming entertainers of the 20th century, Dean Martin. The more I thought about this episode, the more I realised that what made Dean Martin so special wasn't simply his wonderful singing voice or his successful career. It was the way he made people feel. Some entertainers seem larger than life. Others command your attention the moment they walk into a room. But Dean never seemed to need to do any of that. It was just something so wonderfully relaxed about him. He never looked as though he was trying too hard. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He simply seemed comfortable in his own skin. And I honestly think that's quite a rare quality. And whenever I watch Dean Martin, I get the feeling that he would have been exactly the same person, whether there were 5 people in the room or 5,000. There was such a quiet confidence about him. Not arrogance, just confidence. He knew who he was, and he never felt the need to pretend to be anybody else. And I think that's one of the reasons people were drawn to him. He had a way of making everybody else feel comfortable too. You felt as though you were being invited into his living room rather than watching the television programme. And even today, that warmth still comes across. And whenever Dean smiles, it never feels forced. Whenever he laughs, you can't help laughing with him. And whenever he sings, it feels as though he's enjoying the song just as much as the audience is enjoying listening. And I think there's something so incredibly reassuring about that. In many ways, Dean reminds us that you don't always have to be the loudest person in the room to leave the biggest impression. Sometimes kindness, sometimes warmth, and sometimes simply making people feel welcome can be just as memorable. And perhaps that's why, all these years later, Dean Martin still makes so many people smile. Not simply because he was talented, but because he made entertaining look so wonderfully effortless. Of course, most people immediately think of Dean Martin's wonderful singing voice. And honestly, who can blame them? The moment you hear those smooth, unmistakable vocals, you instantly know who's singing. There's such a warmth that's very difficult to describe, because it never feels rushed, never feels forced. He sings as though he's simply sharing a song with a room full of friends. And I've always loved that about him. Whenever I listen to songs like Everybody Loves Somebody, That's Amore, or Memories Are Made of This, I can't help but smile. Not simply because they're wonderful songs, but because they make the world feel just a little lighter, a little gentler, a little more relaxed. And I think that's something Dean did incredibly well. He never seemed interested in showing people how powerful his voice was. Instead, he concentrated on telling the story of the song, on making people feel something. And perhaps that's why his music has lasted for so many generations. Because good music isn't just about hitting every note perfectly. It's about creating a feeling that stays with people long after the song is finished. And Dean Martin had that gift. Of course, course, singing was only one part of who he was. He was equally at home on the television screen and in the cinema. Whether he was making people laugh in one of his comedy films, chatting with the guests on the Dean Martin show, or simply singing to the audience, everything seemed to come naturally. He made entertainment look easy, and I'm sure it wasn't. But that's part of what made him such a remarkable performer. He had that rare ability to put people at ease without ever demanding their attention. And I honestly think that's one of the reasons so many of us still enjoy spending time with Dean Martin today. He reminds us that the very best entertainers aren't the ones who shout the loudest. They're the ones who quietly make us feel at home. As much as I love Dean Martin's music and television work, I have a real soft spot for his films too. And whenever I'm looking for something comforting to watch, I often find myself reaching for one of his comedies. There are two in particular that I always seem to come back to. Marriage on the Rocks and How to Save a Marriage and Ruin Your Life. I've honestly lost count of how many times I've watched them over the years. And somehow they never lose their charm. Because every single time they leave me smiling. And I think a big part of that is Dean himself. He never seemed to force the comedy. His humour felt completely effortless. Even when his characters find themselves in the most ridiculous situations, he always had that wonderfully relaxed way about him that made everything feel natural. And I've always loved that style of comedy. It isn't loud, it isn't over the top. It simply makes you smile. Of course, the films themselves are very much of their time, and that's one of the things I love most about them. And if you've been watching this channel for a little while, you know I never just watch the story. I'm always looking beyond it. I'm admiring the beautiful homes, the elegant hotels, the stylish restaurants, the furniture, the wallpaper, the lamps, the fashion, the smart suits, the beautiful dresses, even the cars. And sometimes I think I'm paying just as much attention to the background as I am to the plot. Because those little details help create a world that feels warm, glamorous, and wonderfully inviting. And it's a world I never seem to grow tired of visiting. And whenever life feels a little busy or overwhelming, they're exactly the sort of films I find myself reaching for. They're comforting, they're funny, they're easy to spend time with. You can simply make yourself a lovely cup of tea, curl up on the sofa, and enjoy a couple of hours in a world that makes you smile. And honestly, I think that's something quite special. Because not every film leaves you feeling happier than when you first press play. But Dean Martin's films always seem to do exactly that. And perhaps that's why I keep coming back to them. Not simply because they make me laugh, but because they remind me why I've always loved classic films in the first place. They transport me to another time, another world. And for a little while, everything feels just a little lighter. The more I've thought about Dean Martin while putting this episode together, the more I've realised that the part of what I love isn't simply Dean himself. It's the world he represents. Now, before anyone misunderstands me, I don't believe the past was perfect. No generation ever is. But there are certain things about Dean Martin's world that I've always found incredibly appealing. And whenever I watch one of his films or an episode of the Dean Martin show, I find myself slowing down. The world somehow feels a little less hurried. People seem to have more time to enjoy themselves, to sit together, to laugh together, to sing together. And I've always loved that feeling. I also love the style of that era, the beautiful restaurants, the smart suits, the elegant dresses, the music playing in the background. Even the living rooms somehow look cosy and inviting. And if you've been watching this channel for a little while, you already know I'm forever looking beyond the people on the screen. I'm admiring the furniture, the lamps, the wallpaper, the little details that help create that wonderfully nostalgic atmosphere. And perhaps that's why Dean Martin fits this channel so perfectly. He represents a world that feels welcoming, a world where entertainment brought people together. Families gathered around the television, friends enjoyed an evening listening to music, laughter filled the room, and for a little while, everyday worries were forgotten. And I don't think that's something we should ever underestimate, because life can be busy. Sometimes it can feel overwhelming. And that's exactly why I find myself returning to people like Dean Martin. Not because I want to live in another era, but because they remind me to slow down, to enjoy the people around me, to appreciate the little moments, and to remember that sometimes an evening spent watching an old film or listening to a favourite song can be just what we need. And I honestly think that's one of the reasons Dean Martin still matters today. not simply because he was a wonderful entertainer, but because he reminds us how comforting good company, good music, and a good laugh can be. Sometimes people assume that the entertainers from the past only appeal to the generation who grew up with them. But I don't believe that's true for a second. In fact, I think Dean Martin has just as much to offer today as he ever did. Perhaps even more so. Because we live in a world that often feels incredibly busy. Very fast, very noisy. We're constantly rushing from one thing to the next. Always checking our phones. Always thinking about what comes next. And sometimes I think we forget how important it is to simply slow down. But Dean Martin reminds us to do exactly that. And whenever I watch one of his films or listen to one of his records, I never feel rushed. I simply sit back, relax and enjoy the moment. And there's something so wonderfully comforting about that. I also think Dean reminds us that you don't have to be complicated to leave a lasting impression. He made people laugh. He sang beautiful songs. He enjoyed spending time with friends. And he made millions of people feel welcome. And sometimes that's enough. In fact, I think it's something we could all learn from. Kindness, laughter, friendship, enjoying life without taking yourself too seriously. Those qualities never go out of fashion. And perhaps that's why new generations continue to discover Dean Martin. Not because they're searching for nostalgia, but because that genuine warmth has a way of speaking to every generation. And every time someone discovers one of his songs, watches one of his films, or spends an evening with the Dean Martin show, I have a feeling they'll come away smiling. Just like so many of us still do today. The more I thought about Dean Martin while putting this episode together, the more I realised that he represents so much more than wonderful songs, enjoyable films, and unforgettable television. He represents a feeling of comfort, of laughter, of simply enjoying life. And whenever I watch Dean Martin, I'm reminded that not everything has to be complicated to be meaningful. Sometimes all we really need is a favourite song, a classic film, a few good laughs, and people who make us feel at home. And perhaps that's why I'll never grow tired of watching him. Because whenever I'm listening to Everybody Loves Somebody, laughing through Marriage on the Rocks, enjoying How to Save a Marriage and Ruin Your Life, or spending an evening with the Dean Martin show, he always leaves me feeling just a little bit happier than I did before. And I think that's a very special gift. Not everybody has the ability to brighten someone's day decades after they first stepped onto the stage or in front of a camera. But Dean Martin did. And he still does. And perhaps that's why, all these years later, he continues to make so many people smile. Not because he belonged to another era, but because warmth, kindness, humour, and making people feel welcome never goes out of fashion. So thank you for spending a little time with me today. I'd love to know in the comments if you're a fan of Dean Martin, and whether you have a favourite song, film or television moment. Perhaps it's one we've talked about today, or maybe it's something completely different. As always, thank you for watching, for your kindness, and for being part of this little vintage community we've created together. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and keep a little old-fashioned magic in your heart. I'll see you all again very soon.